Welcome everybody to this CoastWA training session on the CHRMAP implementation section of a CHRMAP. I am Anna Kelderman from Shape Urban. We are a planning and engagement consultancy that operates in the area of coastal hazard planning, and we do a lot of the engagement work in that as well. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which I'm presenting from, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respect to their elders past and present, and also to acknowledge that there are many language groups and mob across the country that we work, in particular along those coastal fringes, where connection to waters and land are really strong and important. And I'd also like to acknowledge that this training session has not been pulled together based on just my experience. There has been a number of different stakeholder discussions, and I've looked at a large number of CHRMAPs, both older CHRMAPs and new CHRMAPs, and this is just a quick list here. There's a reference section at the back end of the presentation if you'd like to have a look at those in more detail. So a quick framing of coastal hazard risk management and adaptation planning, if you weren't familiar with the acronym. CHRMAPs are done over a 7-stage process, essentially. Stages 1 to 6 are their technical reporting components, and stage 7 is part of that delivery component. I guess stage 6 and 7 are really part of how we deliver the recommendations of a CHRMAP. But what is a CHRMAP? So coastal hazards, what are they? So that's identifying what they are. It's looking at the risk management. So what are we responding to and what are we concerned about? Adaptation. So it describes the options which we have to respond, and a plan. What do we do next? Now, plan might be the last word, but it's certainly not the least. We are in a planning framework. This is under a state planning policy. And so the planning component of it is obviously quite critical. It's a strategic plan to meet coastal hazard challenges. It informs community and decision makers and is a plan for 100 years. So it's also a really long-term plan, certainly much longer term than many of the plans that we would normally operate with. In short, this section ultimately defines action and may be the primary reference section for most users. And I'll come back to the types of users. When we talked with different stakeholders, a number of them made some pretty consistent statements, but 4 of the stakeholders that we spoke to, without prompting, wished that they had been more aware that the implementation section was really important. They wish they'd had a little bit of energy left in the tank. CHRMAPs are really long processes, and sometimes it can be easy to get to the implementation end and sort of be ready to finish. So 4 of them said, unprompted, that they wished that they'd known how much energy was still required at that stage of the CHRMAP. And 6 of them said they wished they'd involved more directorates. And that is to say, they wished that they, as they were doing the implementation planning section, that they'd engaged with, if it was a planning team organising it, that they'd engage more with engineering. If it was engineering that had organised it, that they'd engage more with planning, community development, the offices of the CEOs, etc. So when I say most real people will only want to know what's in or read this section, what I really mean is that this is for the average person. So it's really important that we write this section in an understandable way. The next step should be really clear. And I think it's extremely important, particularly if long-term treatment is controversial. So if we're talking about something like retreat, we absolutely need to make it really clear. We need to make sure that we're clear about how long it might take for the recommendations to be delivered or implemented, and that will help a lot of people feel comfortable in the process. So jumping back to those stakeholder discussions that I had, in order to make their documentation a bit more clear for the implementation of the planning process, 4 of those stakeholders ended up developing a summary document to make it easier to understand, including specifically the implementation sections. And then 3 of the stakeholders that I spoke to are already planning to develop a summary document to make it easier to understand. In addition to that, nearly every RFQ that I receive to do a CHRMAP includes a recommendation to have that summary report. So this training session We'll run through a process. We'll go through introductions and framing. So what should a CHRMAP implementation plan include? Including planning and monitoring, investigation studies and examples of those, funding information, challenges faced, and how to communicate. It will also talk about common actions in a CHRMAP implementation plan. So I'd like to present the case for a really clear implementation section. So what is the value of the implementation section? Implementation is the so what. It's the next steps and the action. It describes who does what and by when. It's also trying to take technical information, which the rest of the document deals with adequately, and take it into a less technical framing. And that's particularly the case because not everybody who will be using the CHRMAP will have been involved in developing the CHRMAP. And that might include staff turnover, other directorates within your organisation, and even community members. So who uses it? I mean, obviously coastal managers, the people who have come to this training session because you're already looking down the barrel of developing a CHRMAP. And that can include a vast array of disciplines, so engineers, scientists, planners, CEOs, but it also could include elected members and community development teams. And then we talk about the users of the coast. That could be surf clubs, boat ramp and harbour managers, coast care groups, NRM and environmental groups. So developers will use it when they're considering new urban plan areas. And that might also include different urban design teams and different engineers from development organisations. It's going to be used by designers. You know, if you're recommending foreshore management plans and you are doing a plan for the foreshore, it may include landscape architects and architects. And then the average person, so property owners, buyers, sellers, real estate agents, different investors as well. A good implementation plan section will state clearly what will happen next. So the first next steps in order of priority. I've put an asterisk there because the priority order of actioning recommendations may not mean that the first priority is the first thing implemented. Some of the actions take a long time to be implemented. It's more to do with in what order should we prioritise starting that action. It should indicate the later steps conditionally, and that's really important because CHRMAPs are flexible and there are decisions that can be changed within the course of the CHRMAP. So it's really talking about planning in the short term is much more specific, and we should be expecting those things to be progressed. But then in the longer term, it could be subject to different studies. It should be free of too much jargon. It should be laid out simply and clearly, and it should reflect, as I said, the flexible nature of CHRMAPs. It's good to list some easy wins first, things that are not unexpected, and then perhaps talk about the harder solutions. So let's look at the requirements and where they come from. So first of all, the overarching strategic document for coastal hazard management is the WA Coastal Zone Strategy. It's really important for setting high-level objectives. It states clearly who's responsible for what. And it also talks to the need for identifying under what conditions should coastal protection be proposed. Under that, you'll find the West Australian State Coastal Planning Policy. So this is the policy, the state planning policy that enables all of the suite of documents that support preparation of CHRMAPs. And that's also supported by a set of guidelines, the State Coastal Planning Policy Guidelines. Underpinning those, and really where most people go to for their delivery of the CHRMAP, is the Coastal Hazard Risk Management and Adaptation Planning Guidelines, which are also supplemented by a consultant scope of works, which is the typical scope of works that most of the consultants like myself will receive when we're being invited to tender to do a CHRMAP. Both of these two documents include the detailed requirements of delivering a CHRMAP, so they get referenced quite consistently in this training module. And one last document that I think is really important, and even though this 2003 Coastal Planning and Management Manual is quite old, I do still see it being full of tips and tricks that are relevant today. It certainly could influence some of your implementation recommendations, It's got some really good information about Indigenous participation and common coastal management problems. It's got some information about stabilisation and rehabilitation and revegetation. And certainly, I think it's a really good document to have a quick flick through if you're trying to identify who some of your stakeholders might be in developing the CHRMAP. This is also found on the main website of the State Planning Policy, so it's pretty easy to get your hand on. So a quick reminder, the implementation plan section of a CHRMAP follows the Stage 5 risk treatment section, and obviously a number of other previous tasks. Stage 5 does a lot of heavy lifting for the implementation section. So a well set up Stage 5 report can reduce the extent of this chapter. Previous tasks are defined in the consultant scope of works, but go into detail in Stage 5 about the options available. So just to present that, how Stage 5 might look in a report to you, there's usually a description of the various adaptation options. So there's an example here of the City of Bunbury's CHRMAP, which includes some information about the various options from avoid, planned or managed retreat, accommodate, and protect. This is just an abridged version of the information that's typically available in Chapter 5. If these have been set up really well, you'll find that you have to do a lot less explaining about the options being considered in the chapter that we're talking to today. The CHRMAP guidelines say for Stage 6, the implementation plan, which follows Stage 5, which is risk treatment, that Stage 6 should include a short-term implementation plan, medium and long-term implementation plan, a discussion about land use planning instruments, and a discussion about funding options. And just as an extra, Stage 7, which is monitor and review, is part of the action phase of delivering the CHRMAP. It quite often is included in Stage 6, so monitoring recommendations are quite often described in Stage 6. For short-term implementation, the CHRMAP guidelines require a discussion about what is selected, so the options that are selected and why. So those are the options from the previous chapter. What are the resources required to implement the options? Who is responsible? What are the approvals agencies? What is the trigger for implementing the option? The cost of the option? How we assess performance and communication and monitoring. In terms of Stage 6, the implementation plan, the template scope of work says a 25-year implementation plan is to be developed for each asset, group of assets or sector in accordance with the CHRMAP guidelines. The assets can be grouped, but the same grouping as identified in the medium and long-term pathways is to be used. So let's talk about each of those dot points one by one. So what is selected, what is the option, and why? The template scope of work says, what's the required risk management measure to implement the risk treatment option? And the reasons for selection, including expected benefits to be gained. So here's an example from the City of Rockingham. They have a recommendation in their CHRMAP for time-limited planning consent conditions, so that's the required option. It then goes into discussing what are the expected benefits. So in this one, it's saying that the city maintains a level of discretion over development in the areas that are affected. And then reason for selection. So this describes that obviously the city is in a position to manage the development that's occurring in the hazard zone. Just a quick additional comment here. Time-limited planning conditions have been tested by a few local governments, and the feedback, including legal decisions, is that using event-limited conditions is more enforceable and less likely to be successfully appealed. So the Shire of Gingin, the City of Joondalup, and a number of other local governments are already using SPP 2.6 to deliver this particular recommendation, in most cases before the advent of the special control area or policy in place. So resources to implement is the second dot point that the CHRMAP guidelines talk to, and then the template scope of works appends that with what is required to implement the risk management measure. So typically this is represented as the short-term actions. a number of stakeholders suggested that the implementation of the CHRMAP actually also requires consideration of a specific human resource, so a staff component. And that is to say that some of the CHRMAPs include a large number of implementation actions, and it may have been handy in their experience to have somebody whose responsibility it was to push those actions through the council. So whilst that might be difficult for some coastal managers to achieve, it is at least worth understanding the implications and being reasonable about timeframes. The resource intensity, I think it's worth mentioning that it doesn't seem to be limited by population or coastal landmass. So it's more by the quantity of actions required. So here's an example from the Shire of Murray, very specific year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5 actions. It's listing out each of the monitoring tasks and a series of different analysis and studies to underpin the final adaptation pathway. In this Shire of Murray document, monitoring of a number of areas is required to determine the right time for decision-making of more substantial investment. So this is fairly typical of the CHRMAP. 2 things to note on this particular case study is that the specificity of the dates, we need to be a little bit careful about those when we're writing the implementation plan, as sometimes the dates are already passed by the time the CHRMAP is implemented or endorsed through council, because sometimes that process can take a while. So it is a bit desirable to allow for more flexibility. It also, being a bit more flexible on those sort of immediate year tasks is also sort of reasonable when we consider that grants and funding may not be available in order to achieve the strict timeframes. Notwithstanding this, it's great to acknowledge that the Shire of Murray is also implementing a really interesting collaboration with a Masters of Environmental Engineering student at UWA to help deliver their monitoring program for a fraction of the normal price. So let's have a look at the next part, which is responsibility. So the guidelines have that line item, and then the template scope of work says who will be responsible for the implementation. So the risk management owner. So here's a great example. This is a table extract from the City of Rockingham, which describes some of the options, and then which directorate will be responsible for managing the task. So this reflects the use of a more specific directorate rather than the generic organisation. It also reflects a more recent move to remove external stakeholders from leading responsibility for delivery, where they may or may not want to prioritise those actions in the same way as the local government. So feedback from stakeholders said it is critical for internal ownership of the document and obligations within the budgeting and reporting cycle, even if there's staff turnover. Older CHRMAPs were typically silent on this level of detail, and actioning of recommendations has been significantly affected by staff turnover and lack of ownership. Okay, moving on to planning framework and approval agencies. So the template scope of work says planning instrument requirements and amendments, approvals, processes, and requirements. So here's an example of one of the recommendations from the Shire of Gingin. So this is describing what is required to implement the option. This is a notification on certificates of titles, and you can see the highlighted section. It's describing which legislation this action would fall under, how it's able to occur, and in this case, the wording of that particular notification, if that was to be allocated or aligned. It's important to note that what is required to implement is very varied for different options. So some are one step, e.g. you might write a letter notifying all owners in the hazard zone without any formal approval other than a decision of the administration to write and distribute the information. And some are more likely to be complex, with years' worth of monitoring, detailed design, funding applications, raising of monies, environmental and planning approvals and delivery, and can include multiple different stakeholders. So Module 2 training describes the number of different agencies, and the WA Coastal Zone Strategy further expands on this and links the various acts and legislation that would govern it. We'll move on to triggers. So the template scope of works expands on the word triggers by saying trigger points for implementing risk management measures and monitoring framework to determine if a trigger occurs. So here's an example from the City of Albany. This is a relatively old CHRMAP. You'll see in later slides has made its way through into their planning system already, so it's a good example of that. This table provides an abridged version of the recommendations table, including triggers. In some cases, these are a bit too specific, as I mentioned earlier about dates. You can see that the triggers can be varied depending on the adaptation option being recommended. In some cases, it's a year or a time frame, and in other cases, it's like something that we can physically see and physically measure. So these recommendations in the Albany document regarding monitoring were supported by a more detailed monitoring recommendation per management unit, followed with a detailed description of the monitoring types, where they would be completed, the description to help with scope definition, frequency, responsibility, and review schedules. This level of detail is considered highly desirable for users to set a really clear pathway for the next 5 years and remove any doubt as to priorities, tasks, and responsibilities. So costs. The template scope of work says costs associated with implementing selected risk management measures, capital and recurrent costs, and to provide a detailed funding proposal based on the benefit distribution analysis for implementation of chosen risk management measures. Most reviewed CHRMAPs include costs as already illustrated. However, the phrase providing a detailed funding proposal based on the benefit distribution analysis may not have yet been met for any CHRMAP reviewed. This is realistically because BDAs have only recently been introduced, and the term detailed may be a little bit optimistic at this stage. Stakeholders also noted the challenge of a detailed funding proposal resulting from a BDA, the benefit distribution analysis, given that BDA is focused on accommodate and protect pathways, most of which require more detailed investigations, engagement, clarification before they can absolutely be determined as the appropriate pathway. And stakeholders also reflected a concern with the untested nature of BDA. One stakeholder noted that even if the BDA indicated distribution of costs to private parties, there would still need to be a co-contribution in either dollars or time and resourcing, and this co-contribution may not be palatable to the rest of the community or the council. For reference, the Murray CHRMAP and Draft Gingin CHRMAP both include benefit distribution analysis and note the distribution amount for adaptation should accommodate or protect options be implemented. So performance indicators. The CHRMAP guidelines say performance indicator, and the template scope of work says what will be the indicators that demonstrate progress of implementation and effectiveness of the risk management measures. So each of the recommendations in the CHRMAP would be subject to review, which might include coastal monitoring, inundation studies, preliminary investigations, and concept design, nourishment, planning measures, etc., whatever is in the implementation plan. A review of each of those actions, obviously, once they're completed or once they're initiated, would be important to determine if they are functioning the way they are expected. I've not yet found an example of individual adaptation options having a review component. Notwithstanding, we do have 2 examples in the City of Albany and the Shire of Gingin that have specifically talked in their CHRMAP recommendations about a timeframe for review of progress. So there's not that many examples of sort of interim reviews of actioning the implementation plan. However, it would be desirable for more local governments to undertake performance review of implementation tasks at shorter intervals. This is not the same as reviewing the effectiveness of implemented risk management measures, which may be too detailed for the early development of a CHRMAP. However, one would assume that ongoing monitoring after implementation of an adaptation response would achieve this, including protection structure audits of those same measures. Anecdotally, this occurs on some projects, but not all. Effectiveness would need to measure how the option responded to its intended purpose. For example, did it reduce the erosion rate, the inundation rate? Was maintenance reduced? Did the environment recover? Was the community made more aware? Over time, this could be more explicitly described. So communication and monitoring. The template scope of work says who will need to be informed during and at completion of implementation of the risk management measures, and how will the implementation be monitored and how frequently. Here's some examples. This is the town of Cambridge. One of their key recommendations was to engage the community to present the results and to assess their willingness to contribute to adaptation options. This example from the Shire of Gingin, So internal procedures, settlement agent note and real estate agent letter, and then a Shire fact sheet, so similar to what you might see in the front office of the local government, information about how the community can respond to certain functions. You have a fact sheet about coastal hazard management. This is another example, which is a direct letter recommendation for sending to all property owners and residents regarding identified hazards so that they have an understanding of vulnerability in the area. And this example here is the Shire of Gingin. They've introduced the opportunity for more people to get involved throughout the delivery of the implementation, issue specific. So there's an opportunity for people to register to be involved in relevant groups. So the guidelines then say to include a Gantt chart, which describes implementation, and then medium to long-term implementation discussion, land use planning instruments, a discussion about discretionary decision-making and the precautionary principle, and funding implementation. So I'll touch on the Gantt chart first. The template scope of work says, as part of the short-term implementation plan, it can be helpful to formulate a Gantt chart. Of particular importance in the short term is the establishment of necessary controls, planning instruments, etc. So here's an example of the Gantt chart from the scope of works document, which is originally from the Shire of Ashburton's CHRMAP. And a number of the examples that I've already presented in different ways have something like this in them. And so some of the CHRMAPs that I've reviewed do this in a table format. The exercise is really good for understanding steps and stages for delivery. So it's really important, again, going back to the conversation about who's involved in preparing the implementation plan, having all of your directorates involved makes this quite critical because it can start to give you an indication of what can be delivered quickly and how. So understanding steps and stages for delivery, understanding predecessors, and setting a mindset for each action. So how long, how many people are going to be involved? What year of your budget cycle may it need to fall under? So medium and long-term implementation plan. The template scope of work says develop a medium term, 25 to 50 years, and long-term, 50 to 100-year strategic implementation plan. So this is an example from the Shire of Murray. This is one of the options for planned and managed retreat, which is talking about a timing of about 2040. And then you've got another one here, which is in the same document, but obviously the retreat requirements are at a later time frame. So it's been a little bit more generous in terms of the projected timing, but also the triggers are different. And this is a great example from the City of Greater Geraldton, which is the discussion about the managed retreat pathway. And I think I've used this example because I think it's really clever. It gives the community a real sense of the challenge of the decision to be made under the managed retreat option. So first of all, it's talking about perhaps a do-nothing option, which would say we'll wait till the coastal hazards are so bad that properties are impacted, and then we'll resume the properties under the Health Act. Then it describes a possibility of using a sort of a planned acquisition of property that are at risk over time. So as coastal erosion triggers are reached, obviously the challenge of such an option is that the city would be required to reserve funds to acquire properties before or at the trigger. And obviously they could do that under the Land Admin Act, but there would be a number of challenges and obviously cost implications. And then the third one here, which is talking about coastal protection options, is really saying that the opportunity to consider protection should also be considered alongside the beneficiary pays or differential rating for protection for those particular properties if they're being protected. So this little discussion gives the community the heads up about the different options that the city has to consider this process. This example, which is from the Shire of Gingin, is a slightly different version. It's illustrating it in a table format and also a slightly graphic version to give people a sense of at what stage decisions might be made and what the decision might be at each of those stages. So this one describes a seawall and what happens if the seawall is not replaced. Okay, so the CHRMAP guidelines say 6.1 land use planning instruments. And the scope of works talks about wording, implementation methods, when to apply, trigger points, etc., for planning instruments. So here's an example from the City of Bunbury. This is the recommendation for a coastal hazard risk special control area. It gives information about purpose, the objectives, and additional provisions. This is a direct sort of reference to some of the information from the CHRMAP guidelines, which refer to special control areas and provide some draft text. So that will be in Appendix 4 of the CHRMAP guidelines. And here's a little bit more information. Before I move on to the next slide, the last 2 pages are drawn from the technical CHRMAP, which is full of quite a lot of detail. The information on the following slide is also included in the technical CHRMAP. However, the following slide is a screenshot of their summary CHRMAP, which has just been released. This detail that you see in the last 2 slides is not included in the summary CHRMAP. What that does is it allows the summary CHRMAP implementation section to be concise for the intended audience at 10 pages, whilst the technical CHRMAP implementation section is 28 pages long. So this is the example. So just slightly more simple, a bit more descriptive, more narrative than it is detailed. Good news is we've got some great examples. This is the new City of Albany scheme, which was gazetted on the 27th of February 2024, which has included a new special control area for coastal hazards. And this is the actual text of that. And because it's so recent, and you can see both the special control area and the advice notes that it's suggesting, because it's so recent, and you can be pretty comfortable that the West Australian Planning Commission will consider this content and this text adequate for a local planning scheme review. So on to the discretionary decision-making and precautionary principle text. The template scope of works is actually silent on this particular component, but the guideline does say for strategic planning proposals in coastal hazard areas, discretionary decision-making should involve the application of the precautionary principle contained in SPP 2.6, etc. So it's talking about a conservative approach to decision-making. In all cases, planning decisions must be made on the merit of a proposal and include consideration of a variety of different planning issues. For strategic planning proposals, subdivisions and development applications in coastal hazard areas, the decision maker really should be considering what is being presented to them. There's not very many CHRMAPs that specifically reference this particular part of the guideline, but it is obviously what underpins the entire CHRMAP process, which is essentially considering what may happen in the future and trying to exercise caution. So moving on to funding implementation, the template scope of work says identify revenue raising mechanisms recommended and governance framework through which such revenues to be raised. The consultant will also undertake a BDA to assist in apportioning the cost. So this section is pretty word heavy, so I haven't got any screenshots here, but if you'd like to go and have a look, obviously the CHRMAP guidelines have some really good text in there. The WA Coastal Zone Strategy also includes quite a lot of good text. And the Murray CHRMAP, Gingin CHRMAP and Bunbury Summary CHRMAP all have good implementation plan sections. All of these documents also have some element of benefit distribution involved. So what are the funding sources? They're pretty consistent and most of them haven't changed for a long time. So they can include operating budgets and general rates. So there's a great example in Busselton who have been doing that for a long time. A specified area rate, which is being suggested in Murray, and beneficiary pays. And there's no formal example of a new beneficiary pays model for post-occupancy levies. So there are some examples of levies imposed on owners of properties, say in canal estates where there is an ongoing maintenance obligation, but those are assumed when you enter the estate as opposed to post-occupancy and having something, in some cases, be 20, 30, 50, 100 years after you've owned property. Beneficiary pays options include levies for visitors, and they may also include developer contributions. So state grants include Lottery West grants, royalties for regions through the Department of Primary Industry and Regional Development, in which case you need to speak to your local development commission. state natural resource management grants, the riverbanks grant schemes through DBCA, and the Growing Regions program. You also have CoastWA grants, so the CAP grants, the HCAP grants, CoastWest grants, and the CHRMAP grants. And WOLGA can help with assisting local governments to facilitate those. It is really important to understand that nearly all of the grants that you may be able to access have a co-contribution requirement, and in most cases that's 50%. So even if you can obtain a grant, you are still going to have to figure out, probably through your ordinary rates, how to fund the other 50%. At a federal level, you have the Disaster Ready Fund and the National Disaster Risk Reduction Grants. I think it's really worth recognising that the federal grant system changes probably more regularly than the state grant system, and that these federal sources are not for coastal hazard management specifically. The Disaster Ready Fund is $200 million per year for 5 years, but it's divided between all states and territories and across fields such as bushfire, stormwater, evacuation centres, and community resilience strategies. So it's, obviously it would have a large number of people looking to access that fund. Funding equity may be one of the biggest challenges in delivering CHRMAP. Obviously, the cost for coastal management can be really high. Beneficiaries may not quite understand the number of different places across the state that these things are being considered, and the total cost to the state, and that's taxpayers. WA Coastal Zone Strategy is very clear that beneficiaries should pay, and so there's quite a bit of work to be done to navigate that system. And I just point back to the Geraldton example, which has done a good job of explaining the different ways that a local government might look at this challenge. So a bit of a summary of the case studies that I looked at, and remembering that big long list. So 21 different CHRMAPs reviewed between 2014 and 2024. They range from a very, very short and somewhat vague 6 pages through to a whopping 76 pages. None met all of the guidelines or specifics from the scope of works documents. Probably the one area where it was most apparent was that more than half remained silent on who was responsible or how it would be funded. So that means there may not have been somebody who has taken on that action, and certainly there may not be any form of recognition that there is a funding gap. None of them followed the scope of guidelines documents strictly from sort of A to Z. The variations were fairly significant, and I think that reflects on who the author is and the sponsor of the document, so which section in the local government may be dealing with it. Some of them start at the management unit recommendations and finish with funding, which is a bit more like the scope document. Some start at the planning and monitoring actions and finish with the review components. And some put planning and funding in a separate chapter. So on this one, interviews suggested that the more clear the recommendations, so the who, what, where, when, and why, the more likely it was for the action to get implemented. So this next example is from the City of Bunbury's summary CHRMAP document, which is trying to answer all of the dot points of the CHRMAP guidelines in one table. You can see the options in the left, you can see where it applies, a short description of what that looks like, who's responsible, the funding and cost, and the time frame and trigger. The City of Bunbury is one of the local governments that introduced an internal document which is incredibly detailed about who's responsible and when things will be actioned. So the review tells us that the development of this section is evolving. The rest of the CHRMAP guidelines, which are predominantly quite technical, so the practitioners, as we become more familiar with what's required by the user, we are improving on this section. I guess the examples referenced in this presentation each have excellent elements, and the best examples have a technical document and an easier to read version. So let's have a look at some of the common actions that you'll find in a CHRMAP implementation plan. And this is supplemented by the fact sheets that you can download from the website as well. So in the planning component, you'll see common actions being notifications on title and limited planning consents, structure plan and foreshore management plan reviews or preparation, asset audits or management plans, and emergency evacuation planning. I've just put an asterisk on the notifications and the planning consents, as those two things can be quite controversial. And when the community first encounters them, you will sometimes find a bit of backlash or unrest. There's also local planning strategy reviews, the special control area in the scheme, local planning policy to support the special control area, reservation of land and managed retreat planning. And again, just an asterisk there next to the ones that can attract some attention. In terms of investigations, these are fairly typical: sand and rock source, flood and groundwater, if there's any form of concern of a groundwater implication as well as inundation, geotechnical survey, bathymetry, metocean, and different leaseback and land swap investigations that might be considered. Common CHRMAP actions that are monitoring actions, and they're typically protection structure audits, routine beach and dune surveys, and corresponding monitoring photos. And then if we jump into the actions that might look at protect options, they can include delivering on options that are already designed, but more often they will include a number of investigations and monitoring, feasibility studies, detailed design, etc., dune rehab and planting programs, and the management of beach access. In terms of managing beach access, I've got another asterisk there. This is sometimes an area where the community also has a bit of pushback, particularly if we're closing off beach access points or restricting four-wheel drive access. So just something to be aware of there. In terms of funding, common CHRMAP actions include rates and levy, specified area rates investigations, more cost benefit and benefit distribution analysis once options are more confirmed, engagement with the community on funding options specifically, and then different grants and funding applications. Again, just a reminder that grants are not guaranteed and that they are typically a 50% co-contribution. And then communications. A number of CHRMAPs are now including letters to properties and organisations within the hazard zone and advice to real estate and settlement agents where they can be reasonably identified in a local area. Again, this can also be somewhat controversial because the information is not necessarily welcome. On top of that, recommendations to prepare fact sheets and web portals for people to go to access information. Signage and education strategies are really common these days to give people more information about what might be upcoming. A number of CHRMAPs are recommending ongoing coastal reference groups and other minor engagement. And of course, the final thing that's typically included is reviews, both those progress reviews, which I highly recommend, and the review of the CHRMAP itself. Okay, so last but not least, just a little bit in terms of success stories and suggestions. We've got some great examples out there already. Joondalup, Gin and Albany have already introduced notifications to titles, and they have been successfully implemented and tested in court. Property investigation report notification in place for settlement agents and the public if accessed. Murray has that partnership that I mentioned with UWA for monitoring. Their Northern Beaches Alliance, so Wanneroo, Joondalup, Stirling, Nedlands and Cambridge are undertaking their monitoring as a collective, which possibly makes the preparation of grants applications a bit easier. And Busselton has long-term rates levy and has implemented a recent increase again, which is a great news story for that sort of long-term change management consideration. A couple of suggestions that came from my stakeholder discussions. One was about that sort of those asset audits, and the City of Joondalup mentioned that their long-term investment in asset audits had helped make the case for a large grant. In this case, it was one of the federal grants that has now changed names, but still is the Disaster Ready Fund. Also, to set aside rates budget at the start so that implementation actions can be started as soon as the CHRMAP is finalised. There's certainly some actions that you can get onto relatively quickly, particularly in terms of monitoring and sometimes in terms of surveys. So thinking about the 18-month process and thinking about the budget cycles that you might be able to allocate funding from during that time, I think is a really clever thing to do. And last but not least, a number of the stakeholders that I spoke to mentioned the challenges of endorsement of the CHRMAP, and the suggestion was that elected members being involved earlier from the start of the CHRMAP would have helped smooth that process somewhat. And then, as has been mentioned several times, engaging heavily with our internal resources, so planners, parks managers, asset managers, etc. So lots of briefings at implementation stage, and some organisations have begun to do staff training internally. So that's the end of the session. A big thank you for the team. A big thank you from the team for listening. A few little slides left, which is references, and I will just run through them very briefly. Again, those CHRMAPs that we reviewed when looking at this training module, and then the references, CoastWA and WOLGA documents. There was also some work done previously by both of those organisations in terms of surveys, and of course the links to all the SPP and related documents. So that's a thank you again from me. I hope you enjoyed this training session. Thank you.